speak in the chamber, please raise your hand. For those on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. We will alternate between speakers in the chamber and those on Zoom. And a special note again, for those attending remotely, please note that those in the chamber will be unable to use the chat facility. If you want to say something in chat, please just pop your hand up. If possible, Zoom attendees are required to leave the camera on at all times. Thank you very much. So moving on to the agenda, we have apologies for absence. Sally?
Yeah, apologies have been received from Councillors Dilwyn Roberts and Tristan Lewis, also Ewan Davis, the Chief Executive, and Rhiannon Gareth, Head of Law and Governance.
Thanks very much, Sally. Item 2, declarations of interest. Have we any declarations?
Excuse me, Madam Chairman, there's also apologies for Councillor Nia Owen.
She's here. Sally just says Nia's here. Councillor Austin, thank you.
Oh, she here, is she? All right, okay, sorry.
Lovely, thanks very much. So no declarations of interest. We move on to item 3, urgent matters. I'm not aware of any urgent matters. We'll now go on to the minutes of the previous meeting, the 4th of July, 22 pages 4 to 13. Have we a proposer and a seconder, please?
I propose Councillor David Jones.
Councillor Gareth, thank you. Could we all show, please, members? Thank you very much. We move on to item 5, minutes of the Governance and Audit Committee from the 20th of June 22, pages 14 to 25. Have we a proposer and a seconder for these minutes, please? Councillor Paul, thank you. And Councillor Nigel, lovely, thank you. Could you show, please, members? Thank you very much. We now move on to item 6, minutes of the Conway Opportunities Board, the minutes of 23rd of June 22, pages 26 to 28. Have we a proposer and a seconder for those?
Happy to propose those, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Nigel. Have we a seconder? You second. Thank you, Councillor Harry. All show, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, members. We now move on to item 7, questions to Cabinet members. There are no questions at this meeting. We'll now go on to item 8 to review the forward work programme, and Sean is going to step into Dawn's shoes and do this for us. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah. Can I just, before we move on to the forward work programme, I think it's important for me just to note that on the front of the agenda sheet, Councillor Charlie McCoubry is listed as a committee member. I can confirm that he is not a committee member of the Finance and Resources Scrutiny Committee, so apologies for that.
If you want, Charlie.
So yeah, moving on to the forward work programme, only 2 amendments. One report was supposed to be here today, the Renewal programme progress report. Just to explain that it hasn't come today. The Workwise 2020 framework was approved just in June. Then the supporting HR policies went through the democratic process in July. We moved as a local authority into the green phase on the 4th of July. So really the progress report didn't add anything that elected members aren't already aware of. So it didn't seem much point in bringing the update report. So the next update report is due on the 3rd of October. And then another request regarding an update from the North Wales Economic Ambition Board. The strategic director is on annual leave when the report is due to be submitted. So there's been a request to defer from the 5th of September meeting to October, which seems reasonable.
Lovely, thanks very much, Sean. Are we all content with that, members? If so, could I have a proposer and a seconder for this, please? Any? Councillor Dave, thank you. Propose. Second. Councillor Paul, thank you very much indeed. Marvellous. We're about to move on to the first report. Can I just remind members about the timings? We've been running on rather a lot with these meetings. all very good debate, obviously, but I'm going to try and keep the timings tight because officers have other commitments afterwards. So we'll move on to item 9A, review of reserves and balances held at 31/3/22, and Amanda Hughes, our strategic director, is going to present this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. Yes, so this report effectively sets out information about our balances that we currently hold, but also a little bit of contextual information about our requirement to hold a prudent level of reserves, obviously to assist and aid our financial resilience and financial sustainability. So at the year end, our reserves, all of our reserves, the full quantum of them, stand at 48.138 million. Our reserves are there effectively to address specific pressures that we know about, risks facing us in our budget, and to provide a general sort of contingency. And whilst 48.138 million may sound like quite a substantial amount of money, I can confirm that we are one of the lowest levels of reserves. We're holding one of the lowest levels of reserves across Wales, compared to other local authorities, and also that much of those reserves are set aside for specific purposes and are earmarked for specific purposes, and are not necessarily then there as available funds as such. I've set out in the report, as I say, some of the regulatory sort of background to why we hold reserves, and there's a bulletin from it's called a LAP bulletin. Basically, it's from SIPFA, who are the accounting regulatory people who set the accounting requirements for local government across the UK, and they've effectively set out in that guidance sort of as I say, some of that regulatory information. And on the back of that, I have also updated the reserves and balances policy that we have within Conwy. The updates as such are very minor, merely just to refer to the latest guidance and so on and so forth, and quote the latest figures. So as part of the report, I'd look for you to be approving that as well. But just then, as I say, going back to the specific details of the reserves. So in the appendix, in Appendix 3, an awful lot of detail about those reserves is shown. But in paragraph 3.11 in the report, I've set out at a high level what those reserves are. And effectively, we have 34.8 million of earmarked reserves. So as I say, sums that we've set aside for specific purposes and specific risks and challenges, and to support corporate and service needs. We have general balances, so they're completely unearmarked and effectively are a rainy day pot, as it were, of 3.5 million. And there are earmarked reserves to do with capital. So in other words, can only be spent on capital spend, can't be spent on revenue activity, of 9.7 million. It's also worth noting that of the 34.835 million, 10 million of that belongs to the schools as part of the delegated budget arrangements, and that isn't money that's available to the council to support other services. It has to be used to support schools only. So effectively, that brings the earmarked reserves down from 34 million to 24 million. There are some specific reserves I've set out in paragraph 3.19 that I just want to particularly draw your attention to. The budget recovery plan reserve has been increased during the year, from the last year's position as a result of some of the additional grants we had at the end of the year. But I've also taken out of that 709,000 and set that aside in a specific reserve to fund one-off business cases that were supported as part of the 22-23 budget setting process. That was a decision to use one-off funding for that purpose, and therefore 2.4 remains in that budget recovery plan reserve. I've also, as part of closing the accounts, set aside an amount of money specifically for the loss of hardship grant funding. You'll recall that we received significant funding over the last 2 years from Welsh Government to support funding or to support additional expenditure and lost income as a result of the pandemic. All of that funding, or pretty much all of that funding, has now ceased, but we are still incurring certain expenditure. So there's expenditure, for instance, within social care, children's services, which is still being incurred and hasn't fallen away. That we're therefore going to have to cover from existing budgets, and some of our income loss that we previously incurred, so with the Venue Cymru, with leisure centres, etc. Some of that hasn't yet returned to pre-pandemic levels, and therefore there is a real risk that we're going to still have expenditure and still have lost income within the current year's budget situation, which we're not going to get back from hardship monies, and therefore I set aside, subject to your endorsement, an amount of money as part of the closure of the accounts to cope with that loss of hardship. I would suggest that when we get to the end of this year, if to the extent that there's any funding left in that pot, then I guess at that point a decision could be taken to transfer any balance to either to another reserve or to general balances. And also then there is a reserve set aside for the pay award. You'll be aware of the mounting inflationary pressure to do with the pay award. The budget included a provision of 4%. It looks likely now that that's not adequate, and we'll touch on that in one of the next reports. And therefore, money's been set aside again for that purpose to assist. So I guess in terms then of your scrutiny today, it's to look at the reserves that we've got, and obviously take a view or make recommendations as to whether they're appropriate, etc. Bear in mind, it's an ongoing process to review reserves, and I'm aware that Cabinet will be working with the heads of service, etc., to continue to review the reserves on an ongoing basis. And they will be formally reviewed as part of the budget process again for this coming year. Just in terms of talking about or touching on the level of reserves we ought to hold, there isn't any specific guidance about the level of reserves we ought to hold. It is ultimately a decision or a judgment by myself as a Section 151 officer, plus obviously yourselves as members, as to whether we hold a prudent level of reserves. But there is I guess a historic floating amount of 5% that would suggest we should hold 5% of net budget in general balances now. So not in earmark reserves, in our general balances. So we currently hold 3.5 million. 5% would represent 12.8 million. So we're quite some way away from the level of reserves that we maybe ought to hold as a general balance, and I think actually the budgetary pressure this year in and of itself demonstrates actually how important it is to have a reasonable level of reserves in contingency, because certainly you can see again in the future report that there is considerable pressure coming through, and had we not had or had we not been able to bolster our reserves over this last couple of years, then I think we would potentially now be facing a very serious position. So I think it's a positive thing, and that we now have more reserves, but I don't anticipate next year them being as high as they are this year, because I suspect we are going to have to use some of them to support this year's budget. So I guess in that context, I guess what I'm trying to say is whilst on the face of it they look quite substantial, and clearly we need to get the balance between holding adequate funding to support our emergency situations, but equally not to hold so much that we're effectively sitting on money when it could be being effectively used for other purposes. But I think in this instance, I would say the level of reserves that we hold at the moment are reasonable, and I do think we need, as best we can, to protect them and potentially to see them grow over time, particularly in relation to our general balances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Amanda. Questions, please, members. Councillor Gareth. Thank you.
Hi, Amanda. Going back to the suggested level of 12 million, doesn't seem to be anything in there as to how we expect to get there and when we expect to get there. Obviously, we're not going to get there over a short-term period, but is there any sort of medium or long-term plan to get to that 12 million?
Yeah, in terms of the detail of that, I guess I would be looking to discuss that a little bit more in the medium-term financial strategy, hence why I've not discussed it here. Having said that, I think realistically, I guess I don't have a simple solution of how we're going to get there, because I think the budgetary pressure that we're going to be facing for the next couple of years and potentially into the future is so immense that I think it's not going to be an easy decision, therefore, to explicitly set funding aside in order to build reserves. So I think my view really would be around needing to protect the reserves that we have as much as possible, and therefore minimise the need to draw on them, and also potentially look at those opportunities over time of any windfall or other one-off monies or one-off opportunities within the year where we can add to them, because I'm not convinced, because of the budgetary pressure, that a conscious budget decision to set money aside into reserves is going to be that palatable in the context of the other cuts and what have you that we might face in the budgetary pressure. So yeah, I don't have a simple answer because unfortunately the funding is incredibly tight.
Yeah, as I said, I can understand the pressures, but without that medium or long-term plan, the danger is we're never going to get there.
Thank you, Councillor Gareth. We have Charlie next, and then Councillor Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for letting me speak. It's a very fair point you raised, Gareth, but fundamentally, we're not masters of our own destiny. 73% of our funding comes from central government, so we can do our only things we can do is raise council tax or raise parking charges and all the rest of it, but that's only a small part of our revenue stream. So it's incredibly difficult to have a predictable forward path when you're reliant on such a large chunk of your funding coming externally. We know the next couple of years, we've been told that's going to be considerably lower, so those pressures remain. Just on another point, I wanted to thank Amanda for the appendices, but members, there's a lot of detail in there. I would point out it's very much a starter for 10. My cabinet will be going to their heads of service and going through that absolutely line by line. And these are professional officers who feel that's where the pressures are, but we have to be very mindful that these pressures might materialise, they might get worse. So it's a working process for us to make sure they're all appropriate. And if difficult choices are to be made, we need to look at each of those totals and go, actually, yes, we'd like to support that, but we can't, as we've done with the business cases last year, as we do with our capital programme. So, Cheryl, you made the point about wanting to stay the time. We could be here for an awful long time going through line by line, but I just wanted to give members reassurance that that's a real high priority for me and my cabinet to make sure that everything in here needs to be here and continues to need to be there. So thank you for letting me speak, Chair.
Thanks very much, Leader. Councillor Paul.
Thank you. I've got 3 points or 3 questions. I've made some notes. I feel the need to encourage change in this discourse, this narrative about reserves. I don't have a problem with officers advocating increases in Conway reserves. But the settled will of electors and the previous administration was to keep reserves low. They were largely content with the authority being less resilient and a riskier local authority. Officers may say previous administrations got away with this, This new administration may have a different view, but I do not see council taxpayers wanting to pay significant tax increases to bolster reserves. That's the first point. The second point is the 2014 SIP for Guidance Bulletin seems a little dated to me and does not anticipate the cost of living situation we face in the here and now in 2022. As circumstances change, even professional thinking changes. Maybe a new bulletin is on its way. And the third point, and this is building on Charlie's point about the reserve lines in Appendix 3. It's a long list of reserves, but it does cause concern. And probably if I give one specific example, that will indicate. There's a specific example where it says to support the maintenance and development of Llandudno Promenade area, 29,557. First, why does Llandudno Promenade get preferential treatment over promenades from Llanfyddechan to Kimmel Bay? No reserves for them, maybe an issue for another day, picking up on Charlie's point. Like most reserves in the list, it was not used. Maybe the specific reserve has been there for a number of years and is rarely touched. If so, it should be deleted or lowered. And this may be true in other reserves, especially for the less specific reserves.
Thank you very much, Councillor Paul. Does anyone want to comment? Councillor Mike, were you?
Yeah, I hear you, Paul. Absolutely loud and clear. And I think, that's the work we have started as a cabinet, looking at the lines. And that will be part of the process is, what's that for? How long's it been there? I won't pick out specifics, but, how long's it been there? Unfortunately, I hate snow, Paul, because we have a winter maintenance one, and if it doesn't snow, we don't spend the 300,000-400,000 that's in there. But as I say, each line will be forensically looked at. Is what I want as a cabinet, supported by the leader, and we will be looking at exactly the point you raise, and it's a fair point, Paul. So if that helps, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mike. Have we got any other questions? Any other speakers? Councillor Dave.
David Carr, Collingwood. I'm looking at page 115 through 22 about additional pressure on homelessness. It says here it's 22,000 a year it costs to keep a homeless person in bed and breakfast, and we're looking at refugees coming in and understand they're being put in bed and breakfast accommodation initially, and we've got 10,500 extra money for this. I think it's a bit optimistic that we won't have to dip into reserves.
Sorry, Councillor Dave, that this is on the next report.
Oh, is it? Well, I'm a bit far ahead. Is it all right if I ask the question now, though?
If we deal with that in the next one, is that okay?
You can do if you want to.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Oh, okay, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, we have a couple of Councillor Anne, then Councillor Harry, then Councillor Nigel. Councillor Anne.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the report, Amanda. I mean, I have quite a bit of sympathy of Gareth's view contained within these sort of first few comments. And whilst some of us were from previous administrations, there was a lot of concern around use of reserves, inappropriately really, because it was tackling recurring pressures rather than necessarily resolving them. So just an observation and response there. I'm really pleased. I mean, obviously, you know that I talk a lot about schools, and I'm really pleased that the report that Amanda's contained within the report some contextual information about the school situation, particularly around reserves and balances. And why I'm particularly keen is that, in previous times, we just had sort of one-liners, and therefore we were in danger of forming a view that schools funding in Conway was without issue or without frontline concern. But based on the comments that the Chair is making, just a point of clarification, Amanda, to see if you endorse the comments made. we're saying that there's £10.7 million of balances for schools, and on the face of it, that looks like, wow, really healthy. And within your Appendix 3, there's no clear purpose identified within there, although there are for all the other services. Now, I appreciate these are delegated sort of balances in terms of the way schools are administered. But am I right in interpreting that 9.8 million of the 10.7 million balances in schools have a clear purpose? In the sense that 4.9 million is identified schools funding gap, which is a recurring pressure, and then the other 4.9 million is yet to be spent ring fence COVID grants. Is that endorsed by you, Amanda, as opposed to just the view of the chair of the budget forum?
Thank you, Councillor Anne. I suppose sorry. It is the view of the chair of the budget forum, so I haven't scrutinised it in huge detail, but I've no reason to not support that view as such. I mean, what I would say, just in relation to the COVID grants, etc., is as with our own grant, some of our own reserves, which have been supplemented by COVID grants. You know, there is always potentially the option of redirecting those at a later point. So with a caveat. I've no reason to doubt the figures, but I haven't scrutinised them in detail. I don't know whether I'll just perhaps look to my colleague David Jones, who's the education accountant, and see whether he may have a better view.
Thank you. David Jones, accountant for education. What the chair of the School Budget Forum tried to represent there is, rather than just a point in time, is looking forward. So yeah, was it 4.9 million is that funding gap? All the grants have been justified. We've claimed the money and we've satisfied the conditions of the grant. However, there's still further to achieve to meet the full aims of those grants. And that work will still be carrying on when the pupils come back in September. So whilst there is money in the reserves, it is intended to continue that work to support the pupils. And the value of the grant that came through, that's right, it was another 4.9 million. So majority of those reserves are committed. And that's what the chair was trying to illustrate is moving forward. It's not just free at that point in time. There is a plan for all those reserves.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Councillor Anne, did you want to comment further?
Yeah, no, I just thanks for that clarification and really sort of endorsement, really, because in some respects, what I'd probably just like to see within Appendix 3 is just that comment succinctly put, so that we can see what the clear purpose of the school reserves are, because sometimes I think in some of our conversations we lose sight of the fact that David has just made, because on my calculations the usable reserves of schools therefore are not 10.7 million balances, it's 904,000, so it's less than $1 million. So that's just the point I wanted, piece of clarification. But just then a final question to Amanda on this, and it's picking up on Gareth's point. About 3 years ago, I think it was, and it's in the forward work plan, we set up a financial resilience task and finish group, chair. And I don't think that's been reconstituted. It certainly hasn't finally reported, I don't think. And in the forward work plan, it's got no date or no programme really. So can we just put that into our work so that we get that established? Because I think that's part of the solution here.
Thank you. Yes, in the sense of, I think, I don't know if Councillor Mike wants to come in, but I think there is the intention to pick up and reform some kind of budget working group in order to use that forum appropriately to scrutinise various aspects of the budget. So yeah, that's not a problem. Thank you.
Thanks,
Ju-
Amanda.
Just,
Thanks,
just to be
Councillor.
clear, Chair, this was a separate working party, financial resilience. You'll recall it. It's on the forward work programme. It's not the ad hoc budget review groups. So just a bit of clarity, perhaps for the next meeting, or via email, Amanda, would be really useful, or from Mike as to direction of travel on those, because I think it's quite important at this stage of the financial year that we see how we're using the resources of us all to manage the budget and the pressures.
Thanks, Councillor Anne. I'll bring in Councillor Mike first and then Councillor Julie to answer your questions. Councillor Mike, thank you.
Yeah, I am mindful of I'm happy to support the working group, but I am mindful of putting extra pressure on officers that are stretched at the moment. But yeah, Councillor Anne, I'll certainly take that forward, and I'll have a conversation with Amanda, and I'll get back to you, and I'll put an email out to all.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Great, thanks.
Councillor Julie.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to echo really, I guess what David has said around the comments that are made in here, that schools, the majority of that is earmarked for catch-up to COVID and numerous things. But I just wanted to highlight how well this evidences the school budget forum's working now, because obviously we've made changes so that they get the opportunity to comment ahead of reports coming. And I think this is really positive. As part of this, and it gives you as scrutiny the opportunity to understand, you know, all sides, I guess, of the discussion and debate. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think that's really positive, and that will happen going forward with anything else that we have. It will go through the school budget forum, which is meeting more regularly and providing comments. So, and they'll get feedback from this meeting as well. So yeah, it's just to highlight that. So thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Julie. Are you content with that, Councillor Anne?
Yeah, I mean, I endorse what Julie's just said. I think to give our head teachers a voice that can be heard by members of finance scrutiny is absolutely crucial. So I'm really pleased that forum now is being reviewed and is meeting more regularly, and therefore the voice is heard. So thanks for that.
Lovely, thank you very much. Councillor Harry, you're next.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chairman. I just thought it might be helpful. I'm more than happy to propose that we note the report and that we also recommend approval for the updated reserves and balances policy. The other thing I was going to suggest, I don't know if I'll make a recommendation or a proposal, I'll just float the idea. I thought the comments that both Paul and the leader made about the level of detail in the report were interesting, that there is a huge amount of detail there, but yet we could always have more detail to actually even get our heads around some of these reserve lines. So I do seriously wonder actually if there is benefit in reconstituting the financial resilience task and finish group. Question mark out of my mind, and like the cabinet member said, is certainly, you know, do we want to be setting up, as Ronnie would have said, a task and never finish group again? But I think there is real merit in that. So I don't know if members would like to make a proposal around that. Perhaps it's just a thought.
Was that a proposal, Councillor Harry?
No, it's just a suggestion.
Just a suggestion. Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'll take the next speaker we have is Councillor Nigel.
Thank you, Chair. Really, it's a question for Amanda. We seem to be hearing the same words from Amanda, that our reserves are the lowest in Wales, and that puts us in a precarious position. Also, that Welsh Government tell us that our council tax is too low from what they expect we should be charging our residents for council tax, and that has a financial consequence to us as a county. And then Amanda today has said that any increase in our reserves would be unpalatable. So my question is, why would it be unpalatable, and what would be the mechanism to increase that? Because I think at the end of the day, it's something that we're going to have to do. And if we don't do it now, we're going to have to do it next year or the year after that. So, you know, we might as well make a start now where those increases could be in small increments. So what do you think, Amanda? What is the issue here?
Thank you, Councillor Nigel. Sorry, when I said that it was unpalatable, increasing our reserves was unpalatable. So, I think we do need to increase our reserves. So what I meant was that effectively, I guess, the decision may come that if for argument's sake there was a desire to put an additional £500,000, say, into our general balances as part of setting the 23-24 budget, then the reality of that, would that mean that we would have to apply either another 1% increase in council tax, or we would have to apply further cuts to services in order to put that money to one side? So that was what I was referring to as being an unpalatable choice. But nonetheless, it could well be an absolutely valid choice. And something that I think should be considered, and potentially, as I say, I'll discuss in more detail in the medium-term financial plan that will be coming to you later on. I think nonetheless, though, we can, in the meantime, as I say, seek to absolutely minimise the use of our reserves and look to how we can ensure that we manage our resources within the levels that we have. I think we can absolutely, as certainly happened last year, council can, in determining the budget, make sure that it doesn't use reserves for any form of recurring expenditure, and that certainly was the case last year. There was just some non-recurring support given, and I think to look for opportunities, as I say, through windfall and other one-off savings to bolster reserves, which again we've done that in the last 2 financial years, where we have been able to substantially increase our reserves over that period of time. I think, as has already been alluded to, I think choices can also be made around some of the service reserves potentially, and whether in fact we redirect some of those to support balances, general balances, as opposed to continuing ahead with certain activity. What I would, however, say, though, and I guess a little bit alluding back to comments by Councillor Paul, is ultimately it is a balance, isn't it, between sitting on substantial pots of money, for want of a better phrase, and not using those funds to do one-off or bridging type activity to support service transformation, etc. You know, you can take that view, and certainly some other authorities sit on very, very substantial levels of reserves, and perhaps they've been a little bit more able to because they've perhaps had higher levels of council tax over the years, and therefore their revenue budgets haven't been so affected. But it is that balance between having an appropriate amount which allows you to deal with unwanted and unforeseen risks and pressures, but at the same time not sitting on such substantial sums of money that you're not using that money to best effect for the residents of Conwy. So it is a balancing act. But as I say, I think in particular, and this year's budget pressures perhaps exemplify why it is important to have reserves, and we may well need to draw on some of that we have this year to balance the budget position. So so I think it's an ongoing debate and an ongoing dialogue, but I do think we do need to look for every opportunity to minimise the use of our reserves and to seek to put more money aside to provide that additional resilience, and certainly as part of the budget setting process, that can be considered as an active choice as part of that process as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda.
You content, Councillor Nigel? Yeah, lovely, thank you. Councillor David Jones.
Yeah. I think as we're at the start of a 5-year term, we need to have a serious discussion about council tax. And as we are at the start of the 5-year term, I think that council tax has got to increase, and not substantially, but over the 5 years, I think we need to start thinking about it now. What do you think, Amanda?
Yeah, I absolutely think we have to do that. And I think certainly, again, I appreciate you may not be as cited, but certainly as part of the discussion on the 22-23 budget, that dialogue was started. And I think, we recognised last year, for instance, that, had we had the same level of council tax on our dwellings as Gwynedd have had over the last 10 years, we'd have actually received £66 million more in income than we actually did. And that £66 million effectively had to, effectively was cut from our services over that period. So I think the need to raise council tax, I think, is something that very much needs to be considered, and certainly we are facing, and I'll come on to it in a little bit, but we are facing some very, very significant budgetary pressure both this year and next year, which I think anyway will force our hand. Having said that, I do appreciate, it's a balance, isn't it? Because clearly the cost of increased council tax is further pressure on our residents, and clearly it's a conflict then about trying to do the best for our residents in terms of keeping their council tax down, but at the same time doing the best for our residents in terms of giving them good quality, effective services, and it's that dichotomy between the two. But yeah, absolutely, I think it's a very definite reality that we need to look at council tax. Having said that, as Councillor Charlie pointed out earlier, actually 70% of our money comes from Welsh Government anyway, and 1% in council tax raises £600,000, and therefore, whilst clearly it is beneficial, or it potentially would be beneficial, it would raise additional money to increase council tax, but unfortunately, because it's a comparatively the smaller part of the overall equation, it's got a very high gearing ratio effectively. So it isn't the only. It's difficult to plug the gap completely with council tax, but certainly it is something that's going to have to be considered very definitely.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yes, thank you.
Are you content, Councillor Dave?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a good answer. Thank you. Thank you, Amanda.
Councillor Paul.
Now I must come back to Amanda on this 66 million figure, or it's sometimes been quoted as, I think, a 71 million figure. Conway isn't Gwynedd, and I'm not sure I'd want to be in Gwynnedd's position rather than Conway's. If you look at what they're doing on affordable housing, Conway's streets ahead, and our work on homeless as well. So the settled will in Gwynedd is what they've done. The settled will in Conway is what we did in Conway up until the last May elections. And I think we need to be respectful of that, though obviously we've got 26 new councillors and we're reviewing that situation. So I think it's a tired argument, this 66 million or 71 million. And I think we need to robustly and rigorously talk about that going forward as a new administration.
Thank you very much, Councillor Paul. Have we any more? Oh, Councillor Andrew, I can see you, and Councillor Dave.
Hi, Chair. Thanks for letting me speak. Amanda, we just talked about 5-year budgets, 5-year, looking for 5 years. So we need to really bring in the level of reserves in relation to what the council tax may be on an average increase, and maybe share this with the population to show where we need to be. We all know there's unexpected things like the pay increases and inflation and things we didn't, but we need to do something like this and show that we've got a project and where we're going, where we expect to be in 5 years' time. I know you're starting to do this, but looking at these excellent reports throughout, the ones we're going to talk about and the ones we've already talked about, they need intertwining, they need bringing together, so everything comes off the same sheet. So I don't know how far we're off doing that. I know you were actually looking at that, so if you could give me an update on that. It also sort of embodies up quite a few questions that have just been before me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Andrew. Yeah, so in terms of bringing the various strands together, then I will be coming back to democracy a little bit later in the year with as I say, a medium-term financial plan, and that will hopefully bring these various strands of activity together into a holistic picture. Because as you say, ultimately they all run into each other in terms of the issues. So hopefully, yeah, you'll get something in the autumn. If that's helpful.
Yeah, that's fine, Amanda. It's just I think we should be sharing it with our residents, because then we can then show where we need to be and why we need to be there and why costs may incur. We can only work on the average money we get from the Welsh Government, so we can share that. I mean, the reasons why, I think to show and to explain to the Welsh residents, Conway residents, right, and the Welsh residents, that 70% of our money comes from Welsh Government, it originates from English Government. It gives them a better understanding, and the fact that you just give us now, 1% is £600,000. I'm not sure it's out there, so I'd just really like to sort of intertwine that, as you say. I quite like the word intertwine with, this ability to share this information. Thank you. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Councillor Andrew. Councillor David Carr.
Just to ask Amanda about the council tax increases, that in the last 5 years, we've had 34% increase in council tax. So the people in the street, they think council tax has gone up quite a lot in Conway. And how can we ask them to contribute more? The other thing about council tax is it's a regressive tax. Working families are the people that hit hardest by council tax. And I know Conway tops the poll, the people in work on low incomes. Poor families working, it hits them the hardest. I think we have to be mindful of that. I'm not saying don't increase council tax, but I'm saying we have to look not to increase it excessively. And I think the last 5 years, 34%, I think was very high.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, I think in terms of I can't quote the percentage over the last 5 years to you, but what I would observe is Conway historically has had very low council tax, and certainly if you go back about 10 years, I think had about the second or third lowest council tax in Wales, and has over the last few years sought to catch that up to some extent. We still have council tax below the average in Wales, and we also have council tax below where Welsh Government anticipate us having it when they give the settlement out, and we also have lower council tax than both of our immediate neighbours. But yeah, I mean, ultimately that's the debate for council, isn't it? When you set the budget, that is the debate, between the impact on the residents in terms of the cost of council tax versus the impact on the residents by cutting services and having a worse offer as a result. So that is unfortunately the very difficult decision that you as councillors have to make when you set the budget.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Councillor Harry.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm mindful we are kind of straying off the report subject, aren't we? But I thought the conversation about council tax was interesting, and I do have on my to-do list an email to either Mike or to submit a notice of motion at some point, because there is a group that have been looking at what they call the fairer share tax. Mike's nodding his head in England. Now the modelling is based in England, but you could look at it in Wales as well, and it's got a huge amount of support from all sides of the political spectrum. If you think you've got John McDonnell and Sarah Sultana agreeing with Conservative MPs, that is astonishing. So I wonder if, and I recognise this would be a political statement, whether or not it's worth this council actually having a debate around that and thinking about whether or not we want to recommend that to Welsh Government as a fairer approach to council tax and maybe a more comprehensive reform to what they're currently looking at. Those are just some thoughts, but I don't know if Mike would like to take that on board.
Yeah, I got your email, and Amanda's looking into that at the moment, and we'll come back with a view on that.
Thanks very much, Councillor Mike. Now, I can't see any more hands up. We have Councillor Harry. You proposed, didn't you? Could we have a seconder, please? Councillor Gareth. Would all members like to show on the recommendations, please? Thank you very much. Anyone against? No. Councillor Dave, you didn't show. Did you show? Sorry, you did. Oh, lovely. Thank you. Okay. Oh, and look how well we're doing for time as well. Marvellous. We now move on to item 9B, revised and capital programme 22-23, quarter one monitoring report. And again, it's Amanda in the hot seat. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you very much. Hopefully this is a more straightforward and simple update report at this stage in the year. So this report merely just sets out the current capital budget, which is made up effectively of three sort of chunks, as it were. There is the 22-23 capital budget that was approved back in March this year. Sorry, I'm referring, my apology, I've sort of launched in. I'm referring to table 1 on page 108. So yeah, so the 22-23 original capital budget was approved, which was for a sum of 32.5 million. At the previous cabinet meeting, and obviously scrutiny committee it came to as well, there was the carry forward of unspent schemes from previous capital programs of 63.5 million also. And then you'll recall council approved a variation to the capital programme in relation to the levelling up bids of 11 million. So this report therefore is just summarising that the total approved capital programme that we now have running is for 107 million pound, and the report just then outlines that as at the 30th of June, the actual spend against that at this point is 3.2 million. Just in terms of the 107 million though, we don't anticipate obviously that will completely be spent in the current year. Some of it we know will be spent in subsequent years. This report at the moment doesn't give you a breakdown between those years, because we're currently working with services to just clarify the profile of that anticipated spend in order to provide a better detail to you at a later point. The other thing I've pointed out in the report as well in paragraph 3.8 is that as you're all aware, and as has been discussed at previous meetings, you know, there is an increasing cost in terms of rising construction costs and so on and so forth. So we are currently setting out to undertake an exercise to reassess the affordability of the capital programme, because what we can't afford is for that 107 million to suddenly turn into 117 million, for instance, and require us to borrow another 10 million pounds, which has obviously got revenue consequences to that. So we're currently undertaking an exercise with services to assess the affordability. So that would either be, you know, that they can achieve what they plan to achieve within budget, that they can stay within budget but might need to alter slightly some of what was originally planned to in order to stay within budget and to prioritise within that, you know, or in fact it can't be achieved within budget, in which case it is going to create an additional pressure. And to the extent that it may create an additional pressure, then obviously that would need to come back through for democratic decision and potentially reprioritisation. The intention is to try and obviously do that in time for the setting of the 23-24 capital programme, because clearly we can't plough on and set a whole new capital programme if we don't know and understand the ramifications of the current programme in terms of affordability. So those exercises, as I say, are currently ongoing and will be coming back to you in due course. But otherwise, it is just an update report in terms of the spend as at Q1. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Questions, please, members? Councillor Paul and Councillor David Carr.
I'm referring on page 109, paragraph 3.8. The sentence says, given the already substantial impact on revenue budgets, the council cannot afford to increase the level of borrowing for these schemes. I'm unhappy to endorse that sentence without a specific report on that matter. It may be Amanda and officer's view that word cannot afford, but that's for the democratic process to decide. And I would propose that that sentence is taken out pending a report on that specific professional perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Paul.
I recognise what you're saying, Councillor Paul, that it is in my opinion. What I would say, however, is that the paragraph goes on to say that to the extent any democratic decisions are needed, that we will be coming back. So what I meant by that was obviously if there were pressure that would lead to increased borrowing, then effectively a democratic decision would be needed. And the paragraph goes on to say that.
Yes, and of course, Amanda, what I'm saying is you may well persuade me of that professional opinion, but there is no evidence to support your statement cannot. And so what I'm saying is I want you to spell out why your view is cannot. And I think that report will then either persuade me you're correct or not persuade me you're correct. And that's why I can't endorse that sentence in this report. And that's why I would want it taken out, and that explanation of your opinion, specifically in detail, should be provided.
Thank you, Councillor Paul.
Yeah, any subsequent reports setting out the additional pressures and the funding of that will clearly be subject to democratic decision, and figures around the affordability and whether it's affordable will be set out in the report. Information around the affordability of the Future Capital Programme has been set out in setting the 22-23 capital budget, and members made those decisions around affordability as part of that process.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Councillor David Carr.
It's just the capital programme monitoring group. It says that they meet regularly. Just how often do they meet? Just a question.
The Capital Monitoring Programme Group meets quarterly with an increased into monthly, subject to the time of the year, but quarterly throughout the year.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Have we got any more questions on this at all? No. Okay. Councillor Paul, did you make was that a proposal you were making also in terms of the recommendations, or?
Well, I'll speak other officers' advice, but my proposal is that sentence in page 109 3.8 is taken out. But obviously, if nobody supports me in that view, I'm respectful of the committee.
Yes, Sean.
So just to clarify, we can't take that sentence out of the report that has already been published. What will happen is that it will be noted in the minutes that a councillor wanted the evidence to support that comment, and the strategic director guaranteed that that would come through the democratic process. I can't take something out of something that's already been published.
Thank you for that helpful explanation.
Are you content then, Councillor? Lovely. Thank you very much. Oh, Councillor Harry, a proposal.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chairman. I'll propose that we note the report and the comments made.
Lovely, thank you. Could I have a seconder for that, please? Oh, Councillor John on Zoom. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, if members would all like to show, please. And anyone against? No, lovely. That's carried. Thank you. Thank you very much all. We now move on to item 9C, revenue budget 22-23 quarter one monitoring report. And again, I'm afraid it's you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. hopefully it's, or thankfully it's the last one, but I suspect one of interest. Okay, yeah, so this report is setting out the outturn position, or sorry, projected outturn position as at Q1. Obviously, we're very early on in the financial year, and at this stage, you know, many of the costs and many of the issues that I've set out in the report are not yet crystallised. So obviously, we'll need to see what happens as we go through the year. I think in broad terms, whilst I think we are facing significant budgetary pressure, we have fortunately set aside a number of reserves to help with some of those specific pressures, as we've already discussed. You'll see in Appendix 1 the detail of the latest projected outturn, which is set out in column 3, as compared with the original budget set in column 1. Just to note that in the original budget, I have disaggregated the centrally held budgets that we had in place for the April 2021 pay award and the impact of the national insurance increase that was applicable from the start of the year. I hadn't been in a position to disaggregate them as at when the budget was set, because the pay award hadn't been announced in time. So effectively, I've now actioned that, and there was a previous approval of a delegation for me to do that at an earlier point in time. So Appendix 1 at the moment then reflects a projected outturn overspend of 1.8 million across services. The pressures are coming from education, home to school transport, and also ERF. And whilst not all of it is to do with inflation, a significant proportion of these overspends are to do with mounting inflationary pressure, to do with fuel and energy in particular. In terms of the school transport costs, there is an earmarked reserve of 237,000, which can potentially again be used to offset some of that overspend as we go through the year. I would also just observe that I think services will be working on, or are working on, looking obviously to try and contain these service pressures. So whilst these are effectively the projections at this stage, I am hoping that they may well come down in time as services are able to do further work to try and address and contain the pressures as best can be. And certainly, for instance, in terms of fuel, you know, there is some marginal sign that fuel is starting to drop slightly, and whether that continues, who knows. So there's a little bit of watch and see. All other services are at this stage anticipating that they'll be able to stay within budget, but I would observe that I think it would be unrealistic to think that other pressures won't come throughout the year, and I think particularly in respect of social care and homelessness in particular. So that in one sense is sort of where the services are, but there are a number of other significant pressures that I've highlighted in the report for you to be aware of, and the most significant of these is to do with the effect of the pay award. You'll be aware that when we set the 22-23 budget, we set aside an expectation of 4% for pay awards. That was based on the OBR average earning forecast, and it was the amount which, whilst Welsh Government didn't explicitly tell us how much they'd allowed for in the settlement, they indicated that the OBR forecast was an effective indicator. So in that context, we set aside what we anticipate, or what we think Welsh Government set aside in the budget settlement. In terms of just out of interest where we sit against other local authorities, I think whilst many in Wales also set 4% aside, I think some others didn't set quite as much. They only set 3 or even slightly less. And I think in England, not that it's, I'm only telling you for academic purposes as it were, but in England, I think some authorities only possibly set 2% aside. So in one sense, you we did put a reasonable provision to one side. Since this report was published, we've got a little bit more clarity and detail now about the anticipated pay awards, in that we at least know what the employer has now offered. So for the teachers' pay award, there's a suggestion now of a 5% pay award, which is therefore a 1% shortfall for that. For the NJC staff, so for the rest of the local government staff, the employer has offered an uplift of £1,925 in cash terms, which at the lowest end of the scale represents almost an 11% increase, and at the top end of the scale represents about a 4% increase. Yeah, so that's the offer that's on the table. I'm aware one union has rejected it. 2 unions are going to ballot on it. So time will tell quite what the pay award shortfall will be, but based on the new figures, as opposed to what I've written in the report, but based on the new figures, it would leave us with a shortfall of around 4 million in the current year, on top of the pay award that we've already set aside. I think it is highly unlikely that we will get additional support from Welsh Government. They have made it clear that they have distributed all the funds that they have to us. So unless UK Government provide Welsh Government with any additional funding, then there isn't any additional funding, and we're going to have to therefore find that shortfall both in this financial year and in future financial year. So that's a very significant pressure. Moving on then to in paragraph 3.12, I also note that there is the wider pressure again to do with energy costs. We fortunately have a gas contract that's in place till the end of this financial year, but our electricity contracts are due for review during the year. Some of the pressure already set out in the ERF budget has taken account of some of that inflationary pressure, but we have a wider estate of buildings, particularly schools, where there may be other pressures coming through, and we anticipate at the moment that might be in the region of about 115,000. What I would say though is centrally within the budget, in the corporate budgets, there is 517,000 that was set aside as part of the budget for inflationary pressure, or to help with inflationary pressure, and that therefore can to some extent be reallocated to some of these pressures. Just because I'm sure members will be interested, but just to say, in terms of the rising interest rate costs, we are currently anticipating that by the end of the financial year, the end of the calendar year, should I say, interest rates may have risen to about 2.25%. We did anticipate increases as part of the budget setting process, and I think at this stage, I'm fairly content that the budget we have will be sufficient, but it does depend on the timing of some of those increases, and also the mix of the borrowings that we hold and investments, in fact, on the counter that we hold throughout the year. But hopefully that budget is sufficient. And then I just wanted then also to talk about homelessness, which I've set out in the report. So, we have anyway a significant pressure with homelessness, as you will be aware. That's all, despite the fact that we added a significant level of money into the budget for this year. It is nonetheless a budget that's still under significant challenge with mounting pressure. The issue that I particularly referred to in the report is also then to do with the Ukrainian refugees. Obviously, Conwy, along with many others, as welcomed, is being very active in welcoming a number of Ukrainians into the area to support them in their position. And at the moment, obviously, they're either in hotels through Welsh Government, or they're in individual sponsors, homes, being looked after that way. However, I think there is a very real risk that in due course, as some of those arrangements might break down, that we might find that some of the refugees may become homeless in the sort of wider context of the word, and that therefore will put greater pressure on our homelessness budget again, which I think is a real challenge. We are getting funding for the Ukrainians. It's one-off funding of £10,500 per person, which we'll receive in monthly amounts, in order to allow for the fact people might move between counties, etc. We're also getting additional funding for the education element of that as well. And whilst some of this funding, I think, just going back to the homelessness situation, while some of this funding can potentially be used to support any additional homelessness costs that we might have this year, because it's one-off funding, if we're left with the permanent situation of a homeless situation, then obviously, as I say, that's going to add significant extra pressure onto the budget, and therefore I just wanted to make members aware of that. So I set out in table 1 the range of budgetary pressures that we're currently facing. So I say 1.8 million in terms of service pressures. The pay award in that table I put as a range, but I think it's probably in the region of 4 million, maybe a little bit more, and then inflationary pressures, etc. So we are facing potentially a sort of a 6 million-ish shortfall in our budget position this year. I think as well, I've mentioned previously, but care home fees is another area where we've got significant pressure, and members will be aware of press reports around that. What I would say on that, and I think it's important perhaps to note, that whilst I do think we will have potential pressure on the care home fees, and we have already assured the sector that we'll do a mid-year review in terms of inflation. What I would say, and important to note, is that actually we do have the highest residential rate in North Wales and the second highest nursing rate in North Wales, but we are third in relation to nursing and residential EMI. So there is pressure there from within the sector, I think, which will play out much more next year, but nonetheless, I think may well be a pressure in year as well. But again, social care do have an earmark reserve for in-year pressures, which could potentially help and support. I've also referred previously to hardship monies in the previous report, where we potentially will be facing budgetary pressure as a result of that. I don't have a figure at this stage. We'll have to wait and see, but just to set out that as a potential situation. And then in terms of how we address that shortfall, as I have already outlined in the previous report, we do have money set aside in a pay pressures reserve, a budget recovery reserve, and a loss of hardship reserve. And they, at the moment, would be adequate and sufficient to cover the budgetary pressures, notwithstanding, of course, it would then be detrimental to our reserves. One specific thing, just to explicitly explain, and because it has relevance to that, and also is one of the recommendations, we did make, I have outlined it in paragraph 3.17, we did make an advance payment at the end of last year for a block booking of homelessness accommodation in this financial year. And by block booking it in advance, we were able to claim hardship money in March from Welsh Government. And so effectively, that means that it's spend that would have otherwise happened this year and was budgeted for this year, and therefore as a specific recommendation within the report is that we move that budget that was set aside for homelessness, which we've already spent last year, into the pay award reserve as a one-off transfer, obviously, to recognise the fact we made that advance payment last year. But yeah, other than that, then as I say, in overall terms, we have got enough. We have got adequate reserves this year to address these pressures if they materialise as the year goes through. I have done in the report though just looked to show how that would impact further on next year. And it's touches on some of the debate we've already had. But in table 3 on page 117, I have lifted into there the table that was included in the budget discussions when the 22-23 budget was set. And at that point, what I was suggesting was that we might have a resource shortfall in 23-24 of maybe £6.5 million. Having said that, that is now significantly more because I've just referred to about 4 million for a pay award. So that instantly goes up to about 10.5, 11 million pounds as a result of that, without any other pressures and without any other significant new service demands beyond the 6 million that I'd assumed in that. So we can already see that the financial position that we have next year is significant, and therefore when we come to look at setting the budget for 23-24, you know, there are going to be clearly some very difficult decisions to be made by members in setting that budget. But otherwise, yeah, I hope that gives you a flavour of our emerging financial position. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That really comprehensive report, Amanda. My first speaker is Councillor David Jones on Zoom. Councillor Dave.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, just going to paragraph 3.7. I understand the difficulties with funding pay claims, but I'd like to basically speak in support of the trade union pay claim, which equates to about 11.7%. Just to say that anything below inflation would be a pay cut. Given the cost of living crisis and recruitment issues in Conway County Borough Council, we need to pay our staff at least a real living wage. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just I say the trade union claim was for £2,000 or RPI across the scales. As I say, the national employer has now offered 1925 as a cash amount, and for those at the low end of the scale, that actually takes the bottom scale up to achieving what they anticipate the national living wage in April 23 will be from April 22. So it would what it also then means that is that from April 22, all of our staff, assuming that pay award went through, would be receiving the real living wage. Because effectively, I think the real living wage currently is £9.90, and that pay award would take the bottom scale up to, I think, £10.35. I don't know if Fran could confirm for me, something like that. So we would be paying, on the assumption this pay award is settled around the region that's being discussed at the moment, it would mean that all of our staff were on the real living wage. What it however doesn't mean though is that obviously for those towards the bottom end of the scale, as I say, it would represent I think almost an 11% rise, whereas by the time you get to the top end of the scale, and I'm not talking about chief officers, I'm just talking about the top end of the main pay scales, it's a little less than 4%. Yeah, that's the impact. But yeah, we would be achieving the real living wage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'll come to Harry next.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. And Amanda, took on board your comments about the potential homelessness pressures that we will be facing in year. I also thought it might be useful for new members to bear in mind. You referenced the additional business case that went in to support homelessness pressures. prior to the last election, but at the time the council wasn't actually able to provide that service with the full amount of funding it wanted. I think there were concerns that overspends would still be likely. I'm mindful that this £1.26 million cut from the housing budget is basically a 29% cut from that section's budget based on your figures. And I'm thinking we're only 3 months into the financial year at this stage. So I wonder, are we jumping the gun by approving this fireman or this transfer from this budget line at this point in time? My thoughts on the options in the report, and I'm happy to propose this now, is that this committee notes the emerging financial position and its impact on subsequent years, but that we do not approve the transfer of £1.261 million from the homelessness budget to cover the pay award budget. And certainly we can review this later in the financial year, but I think we've got appropriate finance in other reserves, haven't we? So could Cabinet look at taking this finance or the necessary funding from other reserves, and if needs be, we can look at making this amendment later in the financial year. But I fear that we're jumping the gun, so I'd like to propose that we don't support that part of the recommendation.
Yeah, I understand the point you're making. I mean, what I would observe is I think in a way all this environment is seeking to do is recognise the fact that actually we've already paid in advance in March money that would have otherwise been spent from this year's budget. So it's not a cut to the budget. It is merely to reflect the fact that we had some other money and we've paid it in advance. And had we not paid it in advance, then it would have come from this year's budget. And it's just recognising that transfer of that. I mean, what I would recognise in that, I think there will potentially be pressure in the homelessness budget later in the year. I personally would recommend that you do action the environment, because it's in a way a technical correction of an advance payment, but instead, to the extent that homelessness is under pressure, if it becomes under pressure later in the year, that is then funded through a conscious decision from allocating money from the budget recovery reserve effectively at that point. Because in a way, if you don't do this correction now, you're effectively leaving with homelessness or within homelessness budget where they've effectively, you've given them a growth in the budget by 1.2 million because they've already had the cash spent. I'm not explaining this very well. The cash spent from the previous year.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Look, I do take your point, but as you've said, we do have pressures on the horizon with this. And I think if we go back to the business case we approved only in March, the business case didn't seem particularly confident that it would actually cover the costs. Now, I take your point about we could remove this funding now, only to then put it back in later. Would it not be easier, as we're only 25% through the financial year, leave it where it is? As you say, and I think it's paragraph 1.5. We don't need many firm decisions today. I'm sure you and Cabinet will continue to monitor this, but let's perhaps leave it where it is for the time being, and we can look at reallocating it later in the year if needs be. I mean, there's sufficient funding elsewhere in reserves. I think our general balances are 3.5 million, aren't they? So this 1.2 could come out of that, and then if needed later in the year, that could be topped up again. So that's my thinking.
Thank you very much, Councillor Harry. Got the leader wants to come in, particularly on this point, then Councillors Gareth, Chris Hughes, Paul, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Harry. We had to make some very difficult choices for business case last year, and we did that across the board. The original business case for housing, I think, was 2.8 million, with 400,000 being front loaded to get more preventative officers. Unfortunately, again, with a lot of them, we had to reduce that. We reduced about 400k to 2.4, but we still asked them to invest the money, the £400,000, in the preventative team, with the hope that this money would be saved and we wouldn't go over budget. But I agree with Amanda. It's a technical budgeting point where they've received 1.2 million up front. We've asked them to work to this budget, and I know they'll work incredibly hard to do that. I do accept where you're coming from, that they may not do, because that's been the case in other years. But I think it's fair to other business cases where we've reduced those revenue business cases and expect them to keep within that budget, that we treat housing the same. That was the target we set them. It'll be very challenging, If they don't meet them, then we will scrutinise that, and we will no doubt support them if we feel they've done the right thing. And it is a statutory duty after all. But I think from a budgeting point of view and a fairness point of view, I think it's the right thing to do what Amanda says, but I totally recognise what you're saying. It's sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul in some respects. But high pressure is a known pressure. Housing is a known pressure, and the eternal optimist hopes we'll stay within the original budget that we allocated to them last year. And if not, we'll deal with that later down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Love a bit of optimism. I'll bring in Councillor Gareth, then Councillor Chris. Councillor Gareth, thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it just feels, my gut feeling is it feels uncomfortable moving money from the homelessness budget into to cover staff pay increases when it comes down to it. And my thoughts were is possibly it should go into the general reserves rather than specifically for pay increases.
Yeah, absolutely. It could go into general reserve, certainly, rather than the pay award pressure. Recognising, though, then that the reserve for the pay award pressure will not be sufficient to cover the pay award pressure, and would therefore have to be made up from general reserves. But effectively, as I say, and apologies that I haven't necessarily articulated that well, but it is a technical correction about the fact that we have made a big advance payment which we had separate funding for, one-off funding for, and therefore it is a technical adjustment to that budget. And in reality, it in a way isn't. The spirit of it isn't that we're taking homelessness money and putting it into pay awards. The spirit of it is that we had some one-off free money that we're using for whatever purpose we might want to use it for.
Yeah, you know, as you say, it's one-off funding, but it's likely to be one-off funding to cover what will be recurring funding.
Thank you, Councillor Gareth. Councillor Chris Hughes on Zoom. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I just wondered what other, again, it's on this 3.17, and I just wondered what other options had been considered, because the homelessness budget is a huge budget. We've seen how it's almost, I think it's quadrupled in 5 years, and it's not going away anyway anytime soon. And I know that we have a significant project underway to try and bring forward permanent accommodation as a project. And I just wondered, rather than using this as a one-off to on the homelessness budget and then having to find it again next year, whether we had given any reasonable consideration to using it to try in a way to try and bring more properties into the market so that we can reduce that homelessness and have that benefit year on year, so that it becomes a reduction. We try to develop a reduction to the revenue budget, which actually gives us an amount of money towards pay increases on a year-on-year basis. I don't know whether it's possible, because I know it's revenue funding and we need capital for that, but it's just something that's stuck in my throat, well, in terms of that. And in coming back to the pay pressures, I spoke to, you'll recall, Amanda, I spoke to you earlier this year about the real living wage, and I'm actually I'm really pleased to see that the increase, albeit significantly lower than people need to maintain a standard of living, will at least pay the real living wage to all our members of staff going forward.
Thank you, Councillor Chris. In terms of the use of the money, so effectively, as I say, this 1.261 million is just some one-off funding that we have had from Welsh Government at the end of last year, which we have happened to be able to use for homelessness. So the decisions around the use of the 1.261 million ultimately is a decision for you to, for democracy to still make. The suggestion in this report is that we put it into the pay award reserve. Obviously, it could be put into general balances, or into other reserves, but ultimately it is one-off money, but it could be used for whatever purpose members are of the view ultimately. But the suggestion here is that we put it into the pay award reserve, knowing full well that the pressure is going to require that.
Thanks, Amanda. Are you content, Councillor Chris?
Yeah. I mean, I answers the point to a degree that we can use it for whatever. But the question that I asked really was, what consideration had been given to it being used in other ways, and had there been a consideration to it being used to try and bring more houses to the market in order to reduce the revenue impact of the homelessness budget on the council?
I'll just bring the leader in now, or Councillor Emily, either one, would you like to?
Yeah. There's constant work being done as to what we can do about the homelessness crisis in Conway. I think, no one's under any illusion here that this is spiralling everywhere, not just in Conway, I must say. And year on year, there's increasing pressures. So that the team we are working really hard to try and think of more innovative ways as to try what we can do about this, because quite rightly, throwing money at it year on year in regards to hotels and stuff it's not sustainable in my view. So that work is being done, but I think this specific money, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, but this is just a correction on as to where it goes, and that conversation will be being had and continue to be had as to what we do about the homelessness crisis in a bigger forum than this.
Thanks very much, Councillor Emily. And obviously, we all need to keep it at the centre of this, don't we? The families, the actual people that we're discussing here. It's not just a budgeting issue. Leader, do you?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I just want to say this is a really good news story. As the Hardship Fund was coming to an end, it's right near the death. A proposal was brought forward that if you worked really quickly and brought forward proposals, you could access this money. That was a huge amount of work for a team which were under constant pressure. They went out, they sourced hotels, signed contracts, did all the due diligence, did all the governance, and were able to deliver £1.2 million of savings to this council. And that's not uniform. This wasn't handed out to every 22 local authorities. This was down to the really hard work of our team, which has given us this opportunity to move 1.2 million, whether it goes in the general reserve, the pay reserve. If we don't need it for pay, it'll go back in the general reserve. It's money this council, through the hard work of our officers, was able to access. And I think it's a really, really good news story, and I'd like to record my thanks to them for that.
Thanks very much, Leader. I'll go to Councillor Paul next, followed by Councillor David in the chamber, Councillors Andrew and Dan. So Councillor Paul, thank you.
I think those explanations on that issue are helpful, actually, in my understanding, because I did have some sympathy with Councillor Harry's initial point, but I can now see some of the thinking. And if I understood Charlie right, not having this amount in the homeless budget incentivizes them to try and keep within the homelessness budget. If I got that right, Charlie.
They will do that anyway, but yes.
Yes. So thank you for that. The point I wanted to make, I attended the majority of the service performance reviews. I wasn't managed to get to everyone, but I did get to the majority. And I was very conscious in those service performance reviews that savings were occurring, not savings we would want to occur, but they were occurring. And they were occurring in staff vacancies, because at any one time, if I understood it right, and the figures were slightly different depending on things, but something like between 120 and 200 vacancies at any time. And some of those are long-term vacancies. Not all of them are long-term vacancies, but between 120 and 200 vacancies, there are obviously savings being made on those. Secondly, there were savings being made on care packages, because though care packages were in place, we weren't able to staff those care packages. And if I understood it right, That is something like 1,000 hours a week. Thirdly, and I've debated this, I think, twice in other forums, the sort of work-wise savings. We're told, because of the work-wise programme and the renewal programme and all of that, that there are significant savings in staff travel and in energy use in some buildings. What I didn't see in this report is how those savings are being quantified, and therefore I did sort of expect a paragraph saying these are the savings we're making at the present time on some of these aspects. And there may be other aspects to these, but these are three issues I picked up in the service performance reviews.
Thanks very much, Councillor Paul. I know in terms of social care vacancies, there has to be spend on agency staff, which is obviously considerably, it's something like triple what we would spend on an employee, because of to fulfil those statutory functions, we have to go out to agency for support. But I'll let Amanda answer the rest of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point that I'm sure across services there may well be pockets of savings, but in terms of sort of the review of the budgets, effectively services are coming back saying they will be within budget. So as the year goes by, it may well, I guess, turn out that there are savings here and there. In terms of of some of those pressures you particularly talk about, I think as Councillor Shell's helpfully said there, I think certainly in terms of staff vacancies, there are a lot of agency costs being incurred instead, and actually that's leading to pressure in the budget, not savings in the budget, because they are significantly more costly than that. Equally with care packages, I think you're correct in saying, as you say, that we're not able, and certainly some of the domiciliary care providers are handing packages back, and that is resulting in a reduction in some of those costs. Having said that, again, they equally are offset by the fact that some people and residents are now having to go into residential care when they would have otherwise been in home care or had home care, and so they too are compensatory issues. And in terms of work-wise, yeah, I don't have a specific detail in relation to that. I mean, certainly there are T&S, there must be T&S savings within the budget, certainly, but I think potentially some of that has already been reshaped in terms of moving budgets into different ways of working, and perhaps budgets that were previously spent on travel costs are now being used for alternative activity, which is supporting the new way of working. But nonetheless, you know, it's a valid point, and I'm sure as we go through the year, if there are savings to any significant degree, then they'll come through in underspending and be referred to in future reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Content, Councillor Paul, in which case we'll go to Councillor David Carr in the chamber.
Hi, Amanda. I think you answered the question that I was going to ask earlier about the homeless. You answered most of it. What I was looking at is, if we're getting even more pressure with refugees coming to the county, would there be any extra funding on top of what we've already got from either UK government or the Welsh government? And I think your answer was that it's not likely. And so any shortfall will come out of the reserves. Is that right?
Yeah, so effectively we are getting, as I say, this one-off £10,500 per refugee who arrives with us. Having said that, we are obviously using some of that money to provide the teams who are receiving and helping them settle, and the wraparound services that we're providing. But even after that, I think there will be some of that one-off money still over, and that can therefore hopefully help us with the pressures. I guess what my concern is I don't think we probably will have a concern in year, because I suspect there will be enough one-off money to help us cope with any short-term pressures. My concern is more the future, because the indications are that there won't be ongoing support from Welsh Government for the Ukrainians or UK Government. That basically, once we've had the 10,500, that'll be it. So my bigger concern is in future years' budgets rather than this year.
The other question I wanted to ask was on pay deal. Now, we do have a lot of people that are actually employed indirectly by the council, people on direct payments that are working as carers that worked all the way through the pandemic. The council does actually set the increases for them. Would that be a match for those carers on direct payment programme? Would they be getting the kind of pay awards that you anticipate for the directly employed council staff?
Through all of our rates for external provision, we have already ensured that the rates are adequate to cover the real living wage, which was obviously the Welsh Government's desire, and we have followed that through. So I can't. Yes, yes, they are getting the real living wage already through our rates. I haven't done a specific comparison of what that rate compared to the new rates in terms of the pay award as yet, because obviously I don't know exactly what they will be. But what I can confirm is they all our care providers through the fees we give pay the real living wage.
Content, Councillor Dave?
Yeah, I'm content with that. As I said, it's just sometimes people, particularly on the direct payment scheme, that not unionised, sometimes you get forgotten. And just like somebody to actually speak up, because they do a fantastic job, and they all worked all the way through the pandemic. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So I think Councillor Emily wanted to come in, and maybe Councillor Penny on any review of direct payments.
Just on the refugee point, there is conversations going on between Welsh Government and UK Government about a longer term support package for that. But I don't think there's been much progress as of yet, but that is an ongoing conversation. So obviously, as soon as we get updated, so will you.
Thanks, Councillor Emily. Councillor Penny, I don't know if
yes,
you in
thank you,
terms of
Chair.
direct payments.
Thank you, Chair, for inviting me to speak. Yes, the direct payments are being rolled out, and the percentage is very high at present. And any more updates you'll be given as and when. But yes, they are on targets. They are going out. Thank you.
And in terms of pay review, was it pay review you were asking about? Yes, if there's going to be any review of the payments.
Yes, pay review is going forward as well.
Lovely. Thank you, Councillor Penny. Content, Councillor Dave? Yeah, lovely. Now we go to Councillor Andrew on Zoom. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Reassuring. I'll make a quick point, but we need to lobby, surely, as Councillor Emily was saying, things are happening with the Ukrainians, but we need to definitely make sure there's a support package there for councils for the next few years, and need be, because we may have to take more people. So, you know, this is an increasing crisis. So, please, Emily, bring a report back as soon as you can on that one. My original point was on page 120. I've got a question for either a council or whatever. The estates and management, for estates and asset management, the revenue budget fee is in brackets 430,798. There's no variance. So why are they in brackets for that service?
Sorry, Councillor Andrew, just you're referring
page 120,
to yeah.
Revenue budget, and the estate and asset management. It's the only one that's in brackets. Both there is no. I must have missed a point here, but why is it in brackets? It shouldn't be in brackets, surely.
I'm struggling to see exactly where you look at, but brackets would normally indicate that there's an overspend effectively.
Yeah, it's in the tables. Yeah. Okay, overspend. Okay, I can see where the rest of it comes from. There's a figure and there's a variance, but I can't see why the assets and maybe you can get back to me after the meeting, but it's definitely there in my table.
Yeah, if I could get back to you after the meeting, only because I can't quite spot what you're referring to, but yeah. Oh, I see. Right. Sorry, my apology. I sorry, it's been pointed out to me. Yeah. So in terms of the budget in the first column, it's because effectively it has a net income budget as opposed to a net expenditure budget. So that's why it's in brackets. So effectively, it's a net income budget rather than a net expenditure budget.
Oh, okay, so right, okay. So I would have thought the income and the expenditure were shown separately, but no, that's fine for me. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Andrew. And in terms of support for refugees, I know that we are looking at support from the third sector and charitable organisations. Councillor Emily and I are in discussion about getting extra help, especially for our school children that will be starting in September from Ukraine. So that is in hand, and there's been a very positive response, hasn't there? So thank you for that. We now go to Councillor Anne on Zoom. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. I'd just like to make an alternative proposal to the one that I think Councillor Harry's made. I find myself quite persuaded by the debate and indeed, you know, Amanda's sort of commentary and also Councillor Charlie. So I'd like to turn the Cabinet recommendations as detailed in 2.2, 2.3 and 2.4 as recommendations from Scrutiny to Cabinet.
That's your proposal, Councillor Anne.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And the last speaker we've got is Councillor David Jones on Zoom. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to reaffirm about the refugees. We've got to lobby strongly for future support packages for the Ukrainian people. Central government can't be seen to just drop these poor people into our societies and be seen to desert them in 6 to 12 months' time. So I think we've really got to work hard on lobbying central government and Cardiff on extra funding. That's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dave. Councillor Julie wants to come in, and Councillor Paul.
Thank you, Chairman, and Chairperson even. Yeah, just to say that I actually am Deputy Chair of the Children and Young People's Board with the LGA in London, and as part of that, I sit on the board, the Refugee Board, unaccompanied minors board. But as part of that, I have been meeting with Lord Harrington, who's the Minister responsible for refugees, and we've been meeting really quite regularly, and I'm meeting him again on Thursday with some other senior members from councils across the UK, and we'll be discussing support for Ukrainian refugees again. And he's brilliant. His passion is really impressive, and he's spent years working on trying to support the most vulnerable people and refugees in particular. So yeah, we'll be meeting with him on Thursday, and I'll feed back as to what I can. I'll feed back, but yeah, that lobbying is happening, and he's absolutely passionate that we make sure it's adequately funded and that there's an appropriate network in place. And so yeah, that is happening. Just to let Dave know and everyone else as well.
Thanks, Councillor. And that'll be devolved. We'll have the consequential to Wales because that's it.
Yeah, it is UK wide. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
That's very reassuring, Julie. Thank you.
Just a bit of a positive point on the UK refugees and refugees generally, asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants. I was in the Barbers yesterday, and I was listening to a Ukrainian refugee who's living in a hotel near to where I live. And he was saying he'd already got a temporary job. He'd applied for a course to do his HGV vehicle. And so, in my view, he was very much contributing to our community because he was paying the barber as well for his haircut. And the barber himself is a Turkish Kurd, and he's also contributing to our community substantially. Not only because he's a very good barber, but because he's very economically active. So there are lots of positives as well as the challenges ahead. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Paul. And I hope you were home from the Barbers in time to watch the Lionesses last night. Councillor Gareth next, please.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, except that what Charlie was saying, that we've done some really, or the council's done some really, really good work in getting this 1.2 million. So my thoughts are very much along Councillor Chris's thoughts, is that we should use this money to actually try and address some of these issues that we can see coming down the track, and try and get some long-term solutions with this one-off opportunity, rather than, going back to what I said at the beginning, rather than use it to fund future pay increases. So, you know, we've got to have some longer term solutions, and this is a pot of money that we may be able to use for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Gareth. We'll now go to the last speaker, Councillor Liz on Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Sherrill. Just find it very interesting this morning, and the subject that we've been discussing and the comments from all the councillors. With the Ukrainian refugee families, and that there was a wonderful comment you made, Councillor Paul, as to how they are, the families that are already contributing, to their communities. But I think I'm going to have a discussion with my cabinet colleagues tomorrow as to how we can, maybe take on board all the comments that have been said, and to look at how we can take this forward, working more unitedly together. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Councillor Liz. That's really good to hear. Right, well, that's all we have in terms of speakers. We've had a proposal from Councillor Harry. Did we have a seconder for that proposal? Councillor Gareth, thank you. And we had a proposal for Councillor Anne for the recommendations as per the report. Have we got a seconder for that? And David Jones, lovely. So we'll take Councillor. Yes, we'll take Councillor Harry's amendment first. If you'd like to just recap for me.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chairman. The amendment was as per the report, but simply that members do not approve a recommendation to transfer 1.261 million from homelessness budget to the pay award budget at this time.
At this time being. Thank you very much, Councillor Harry. Well, can we vote on that, please? I'd like everyone to show and keep your hands up so we can, so Sally and I can count Councillor Harry's proposal. 1, 2, and how many? So 2 in the room, and how many on Zoom, please? And none on Zoom. Okay, so. And against Councillor Harry's proposal. So against is 10. Have we any abstentions, please? No, can't see any. Councillor Harry's motion is defeated. We will now vote on Councillor Anne's proposal. We had a seconder for that, didn't we? Yes, yes. So Councillor Anne's proposal that we take the recommendations. Would you like to show for that, please? Yeah. 10. And against that proposal? Against 2. Councillor, any abstentions? Councillor Gareth. So Councillor Anne's recommendations go through. Thank you very much, members. Okay, we now move, we're giving Amanda a rest. We now move on to the last report, the annual overview and scrutiny report 21-22, and Sean Williams is going to do this. Thank you, Sean.
counting hands. I forgot I was up next.
Yes, it's your turn.
So yes, I'd like to present to members. Well, thanks very much, first of all, to Dawn Hughes in preparing the draft annual report for Overview and Scrutiny Committee. The annual Overview and Scrutiny report provides an overview of all the scrutiny function that took place within the authority during 2021-2022. So it details activity amongst the four committees: economy and place, education and skills, finance and resources, social care and health. 3.3 explains the function of Overview and Scrutiny Committee, holding the Cabinet to account for its actions, decisions, and explaining that within Conway we have a particular focus on pre-decision scrutiny. The report goes on to detail how scrutiny continued to operate during the pandemic, during the lockdown. All meetings were held virtually during 2021-22, and all the meetings were live streamed and recorded to ensure transparency and accountability. It goes on to explain that we had hoped to introduce the hybrid meeting arrangements, but we just didn't quite get there at that point because of technical issues. Pre-decision scrutiny continued during the reporting period, allowing any issues to be discussed and resolved at an early stage, and it allows the committees to question the implications of any proposals that are going through to the Cabinet. The chairs and vice chairs continue to meet regularly to scrutinise the topic selection forms coming through, and they continued to prioritise using the agreed criteria. We recognise that during 2022-23 we'll continue doing work with the scrutiny chairs and vice chairs to make sure that the items put forward are prioritised appropriately. The forward work programmes are already quite heavy, and we're having our first meeting of the scrutiny chairs and vice chairs this afternoon. Overview and scrutiny committees continue to monitor corporate and service performance levels. I'm not going to go through all the bullet points, but the annual report also provides progress against local performance indicators. We saw that attendance levels at scrutiny committees decreased ever so slightly compared to the previous year, with an average attendance of 80% compared to an average of 85% in the 2020-21 year. But that comes with the final sentence says that was still an improvement, because previous to that average attendance was 72%. Number of meetings continues to be high, 42 Overview and Scrutiny Committee meetings during 21-22, and that's despite all the meetings being cancelled from March onwards to avoid the pre-election period. Chairs and vice chairs continue to recognise the importance of continuous improvement in the actual scrutiny function, with a particular focus on promotion of the public engagement protocol. We want to encourage more public engagement. We do publish our forward work programmes and try and circulate as far and wide as possible to get interest in items, but we also recognise that's an area that we can improve on. We have developed an online petition scheme. We allow members of the public to comment on reports that are coming to Overview and Scrutiny Committee committees, and we continue to encourage co-option of representatives from external organisations, community representative groups, town and community councils, mainly when we're setting up task and finish groups. That's where the more focused work goes on. We recognise that there was a steady increase in the number of joint scrutiny committees that were being requested, and we reviewed that position. We've gone back to the Constitution, and because the meetings now are so resource intensive in terms of setting up and manning them, that we're going back to what the Constitution requires us to do, in as much as the topic, so if it's a topic that covers two scrutiny committees, tends to be social care and education, then we will take it to one we adopted the process of taking to one committee and making sure that the membership from the other committee was invited to attend. So everybody was still having the debate and the ability to ask questions and make recommendations. Yeah, the annual report continues to try to evaluate the effectiveness of our overview and scrutiny function. And it's all detailed within the report. We have standing agenda items inviting questions to cabinet members, which is used quite frequently. We continue to set up task and finish groups to focus on specific items. The one that was relatively, well, quite successful during this particular year was the review of education funding task and finish group. It co-opted representatives from the school budget forum and school governors, and it provided evidence to inform the work of that particular task and finish group. We were also mindful that this time we could take some information from the councillor exit survey. So all those councillors that decided not to stand for re-election were surveyed, and we asked them how they felt they'd contributed to the overview and scrutiny function. That's listed in paragraph 3.6, the final lot of bullet points. Oh, actually, it's 3.6, so it's the first 3.6. And then finally, just to highlight as well that the annual report covers the work that's done outside of the formal scrutiny committees, recognising that a lot of their work is done within the project and programme boards that we have representation on. So, as I say, the annual report is there for members to comment on. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Sian. Before we go to any members' comments, I don't think we have any. It's quite unusual. Just a couple. Yes. Yes, just a couple of comments. Just quickly on terms of the Common Opportunities Board, I noticed that it said on that the vice chair of this committee gets invited to that. That hasn't happened so far this term, so that's an amendment if we could do that. I'd like to thank all the chairs of scrutiny committees for their work over the past 12 months. Incredibly challenging 12 months it's been with COVID, with pressures of work, and of course the dreaded Zoom we've been battling with. In terms of attendance, I hope we see a rise again in attendance now in terms of people getting back to, hopefully back to normal. And finally, I'd like to thank our committees and scrutiny officers and our translation staff for the amazing work they've done over the past 12 months. It has not been easy to get to this hybrid situation, has it, Sian? No, indeed. And I'd like to wish Dawn a really speedy recovery as well. So just huge thanks to everyone. So have we got any other? Councillor Nigel, then Councillor Charlie.
Yeah, I think you've pretty much covered it all there, Chair. Without the dedication of the scrutiny committee officers, I don't know where we would be, and not forgetting the dedication of the committee members that turn up for our scrutiny committees, and that's what makes the whole machine of Conway County Borough Council so lean and so proactive in its production of services and facilities for our residents. So yeah, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Nigel. And I think they would add to lean and productive, they'd add exhausted as well, I think, wouldn't they? So thank you. And last leader, thank you, Councillor Charlie.
I'd just like to add my own thanks to every single member who takes part in scrutiny. It's a lot of work. I'm really pleased to see there are only two call-ins next year, so I think that shows the system works well. We're here as a cabinet members to listen to you and answer your questions where we can. I think we can. We'll always try and do that afterwards, because I've always said one member, one vote. We've all got the same democratic mandate, and it's here that we prove that. So I'd just like to thank all the chairs, vice chairs, with huge amounts of work, and all the Democratic Services team for everything they do. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Councillor Charlie. Well, if that's all, I'd like to thank you all for attending today, members. Vote. Thank you. See, we were so excited. We were so very excited, and all the wonderful work. Yes. Yes. If we could have a proposal that this goes to, as per the recommendations. Yeah. It goes to recommend to council for approval. Proposed by Councillor Harry, seconded. Councillor Gareth. Lovely, thank you. Could we all show in support of that, please, members? Thank you very much indeed. Marvellous. Thanks again, all. Look at that. It's 12 o'clock. Marvellous. Ahead of time. Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.